Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first in our series of conversations with three of America's, and certainly Tikvah's, most consequential Jewish leaders. For those of you who don't know, I'm Eric Cohen, the Executive Director here at Tikvah. And for those of you who don't know much about what we do, our core business is educating young people, finding middle school students, high school students, college students that have the potential down the road to be important intellectual, religious, and political leaders of the Jewish people, and try to give them an education in the defining ideas and history of Zionism, of Judaism, of the West, and of the American story. And we tend to focus a great deal of our educational efforts on biographies, and the belief that if you want to learn how to be a leader, the best thing you can do is study some of the great figures of our past. And that's the spirit of this series, to sit down with three people that I've learned so much from, that have helped define Tikvah's work and have helped shape American Jewry itself. Roger Hertog this evening, then Elliot Abrams, and then Ruth Weiss, and learn what we can about their education. Learn what we can learn from their formation as people, as Jews, and as Zionists that might be relevant to the work that we're all doing to try to strengthen Jewish life in America and Israel and in the world. Now, Roger Hertog, to many of you, certainly needs no introduction, and we're going to learn, I hope, a lot more about his story this evening. He's been the chairman of the Tikvah Fund for 20 years, and he's helped build, in addition to Tikvah, some of the most important ideas, institutions, educational institutions in America, including the Manhattan Institute, the New York Historical Society, and the Hertog Foundation, which is focused on educating young Americans for their vocations as political and intellectual leaders. I first saw Roger many, many years ago when he gave a talk, I think it was at Catholic University, about his work building the charter school movement. And it was a huge crowd, and I never spoke to him then, but I remember marveling at that point that here was someone who was changing the world through the force of ideas. Then I finally met him. This was about 15 years ago when he was thinking about the future of Tikvah. And I came up with Yuval Levin, an important conservative thinker, and the two of us were there to have a conversation. Little did I know his agenda was clear. He was trying to find the right partner to help him build this institution. Well, Yuval would have been the obvious and probably better choice. Fluent in Hebrew, grew up in Israel, a student of the Hebrew Bible. And at the time, for me, Judaism was a new passion, something that I was hoping to devote more of my life to. And it's really thanks to Roger that I've been given the great opportunity to work with him to help build Tikvah. Since the point of tonight's discussion is to learn about Roger's experiences, I won't go on too much in the introduction. I'll just say three things that I've learned from all these wonderful years of working with him. One, Roger reads everything, especially biography. LBJ, Jabotinsky, Churchill, FDR. Anytime we're thinking together about Tikvah and its work, it's always informed by his incredible reading and study of history, including the great figures that have shaped who we are and shaped our civilization. The second is that he's someone who combines big, bold ideas with practical, strategic thinking about how you get things done. That's a rare combination. And finally, and most importantly, Roger is someone who cares a lot about people. He invests in people, young people, people that are in positions of real leadership in American public and in Jewish life. And he spends time to try to help unlock their potential in meaningful ways. Roger, thanks for sitting down to do this conversation. I thought we'd begin at the beginning. You once described your own life as a miracle, the miracle of being born in America in 1941. The son of two parents who fled Germany in just enough time. And you grew up as a poor Jewish kid in the Bronx. And I'm wondering how that miracle of your birth in America and the circumstances of your early childhood led you on the path that you ultimately have been on.
Well, with that introduction, I ought to stop right now and leave, because it can only go downhill from here.
I doubt it.
You know, I normally, and it's not that I'm so modest, I'm not, but I normally don't like to talk about myself. I'm actually, most of the time, uncomfortable in this, but I thought I had to do this, and it'll be obvious why. You know, I think, you know, when you look at most of life, most people that you know, much of life is shaped by those early years, so to say, the beginnings for all of us, in some way have a deep, really make a deep impression on you. And when I was thinking about this, talking with my wife about it, that's what really came up. As Eric said, my parents were German Jews. They came separately. They met in Washington Heights, the German colony. And one came in late 37, the other came in early 38, so they came very late. They were blessed. I was born in 41, and I was like an immigrant. My parents only spoke German. They had no real English facility at that point in time, either did I. I only spoke German till I went to kindergarten and the first grade, when I was 4 or 5 years old. I never forget, I went into the yard with the kids. I knew no English, and I went over to a couple of them and said, spielen, spielen, which means in German, play, play, want to play. And the teachers called me aside. They didn't have any English as a second language. You were either going to learn English or you weren't going to stay in PS 104 off of Nelson Avenue in the Bronx. That's really what I learned there, what I learned from that early period of being sort of this immigrant. And the one thing I knew, I was a Jew. But the other thing I didn't know anything about being a Jew. My parents knew little. They came, were married here. I had no other brothers or sisters. I had only one living relative in this country, my mother's sister. Everyone else, other than another sister in England, who I didn't get to meet for another 20 some odd years, maybe 25 years. All of them were killed in the Holocaust. And it takes a long time, but you begin to see you really are very lonely and you don't have anyone. And in its own way, I'd say that's one of the first things you begin to learn a little bit. You have to do things on your own. And I'd say the next phase of my life was really, let's say, first when I'm 12 or 13, my father no longer stayed at home a lot. He came and left. So he wasn't really a dependable force in raising me. My mother really sacrificed her whole life for me. She died young, but she sacrificed her whole life. And as I think about it now, we were living, my father didn't provide enough support, as I said, but we were living really on a shoestring for food, clothing. I never starved, I never missed a meal. But I knew, and I think she encouraged me, at 12 years old, I started working. And the amazing part is I worked every single day at a job from 12 till I'll be 80 this year. I never even thought of it in any other way, that it was unusual. And I delivered meat for a butcher shop right around the corner from where we lived on McCombs Road. And it was, I think I made $8 or $10 a week, mostly tips. Sometimes the packages were bigger than I am that I had to deliver. And I was able to give my mother $4 a week, maybe $5. And you would say, well, what could you do with that? And remember, at that period of time, I was, it's the early 50s. Our rent at 1595 McCombs Road in our 5th floor walk-up, about 300 feet apartment, maybe a little less, was $39 a month. So if you could bring home $4 or $5, it gave your mother some extra money to do things. And the other $5 I could buy myself some clothes, because we didn't have enough money for all those things. The other thing that occurred during that period of time was it actually began to strike me that I didn't have any relatives, as I said before. And I began to really understand, like, neither my father when he was home nor my mother would really talk about anything that happened during the war. What happened to all those people? Why did we get here? What happened to all of those other Jews? And it wasn't that I had some deep intellectual interest in this, it was an emotional interest. I was a good student, but I wasn't an intellectual like you. I really wasn't. I liked things, I liked learning. And so when I had time, because we had no books in our house, I would walk to the library, which was about 6, 7, 8 blocks away. I'd bring my homework, which I often didn't do, and I would take out whatever books I could read off the shelves. You were allowed in those days to go into the shelves, the stacks, so to say, and I would read about FDR. We only had 2 pictures in our house. I bet you I wasn't this unusual. It wasn't so unusual. We only had 2 pictures hanging on a wall. Both FDR. FDR was the saint. And I was looking at him and saying to myself, what went wrong here? Why did this happen? And I read about military history, which I enjoyed. And I read about, obviously, the war itself, the conflict, and then about the Germans. And sort of that led me, in that early phase of my life, I was still very young, I actually began to love reading. And that stayed with me to this very day. It was the thing that I loved the most. And I enjoyed it, but I wanted to do other things. And so as I got a little older, I got out of high school. Wasn't that much longer. And my father would be in the home sometimes, but most of the time not there. It was left unsaid. My mother never said this to me, although our health was beginning to fail as I got into college. I would have to go and get a job. I had to go to what was called, most people don't know about it unless you live in like New York or something like that. You have to go to night college. I wanted to go to day college. I didn't even that you could go with other kids. But because I went to night college, I answered an ad. I got a job in a mailroom. And then from a teacher I had in night at City College, Leon Levy, who became a legendary investor. And a wonderful man, a little scatterbrained, but a wonderful man. He would smoke 2 or 3 cigarettes at the same time. And he didn't even know it. But he was a brilliant guy, and he taught a course on security analysis that I took at Baruch. And he said, why aren't you at school? And I made up an excuse. I didn't really tell him, we were so poor. And he said, why don't you get you a job at Oppenheimer? He was a senior partner then. Max Oppenheimer was the senior partner. He was a German Jew, a very affluent German Jew. And they had a small, nice business going on there. And I got this really clerical position. But that was probably one of the breakthroughs of my life. All of a sudden, everything began to change. First, I worked with a lot of very smart people, and they were older. Older meaning they were in their early 30s, maybe 37. But they were really smart.
Mostly Jews, or?
Mostly Jews. Mostly Jews. Not very Jewish. A couple of them strong Zionists, but not very Jewish. And there I began to really actually gain self-esteem, that I could do things other than deliver meat or, work in a mailroom. I saw, there may be a pathway out of this with hard work. And there were two pivotal moments then. By the time I'm still in college at age 24, 25, because you're at night. You take some courses in the day, you take some courses in the summer. But in 1963, I met this guy named Sanford C. Bernstein. He had worked in Oppenheimer. And he was a complicated fellow.
So you're 22.
Yeah. Complicated fellow. He's 37, 38. Seemed so old to me it was impossible. I couldn't even conceptualize, how could a person be that old? And the second thing that happens is I get married. My mother had passed away by then, when she was 56. And she had always told me, she was very smart. She had always told me, you're going to get married young because you need somebody that's going to be your friend, that's going to care for you and you're going to care for them. You don't have experience, you don't have a life without someone like that. And she would, whenever I would bring a girl home when she was still alive, she would look at them. She'd have me stand next to them, literally stand next to them. See the right height. She'd look at how do you look together. I didn't even understand what she was doing. When they would leave, she would tell me all of these things.
Mothers had authority in those days.
She had a lot of authority. And I met this girl named Susan Gurrell. She was a girlfriend of mine. I knew her 4 years before. We knew each other 4 years before we got married. And amazingly, it's 55 years later, we're still married. And in 1968, I was still at Oppenheimer, so I'd been there about 7 years, 8 years. I had really grown a lot. I had gotten a lot of experience as an analyst. I was, relative to whatever I thought I could be, I was even affluent. They were very generous. And I got a call from that guy I met in 63, Bernstein. And I knew him reasonably well, and Susan knew him well. And he had had some trouble. He had started his firm, Bernstein and Company, October the 2nd, 1967. By early 68, some of the people that he had hired had gone. He may not have liked them, they may not have liked him. He was alone, in essence, almost alone. And we made a deal, and I became a partner in that firm then, at 26. And that's really that's the start of the next phase in my life. And from there, I was, I had to work very hard, but this was a growth period, and everything that led up to that period, to 26, 27, was all really the basis, which I had no idea, and I didn't think of it a lot till I had to sit here and talk to you and bare my soul here. what my life would be like and what I could make of it. Norman Podhoretz writes it in I think, Breaking Ranks. I think it's Breaking Ranks. He says, when he came over the Brooklyn Bridge and came into Manhattan, you could create your own life. In a way, when you go from the Bronx to Manhattan, all of a sudden there were opportunities that you had never conceived of before. And your life could begin, you could see doing things, and that's what I mean by creating a new life that you had never conceptualized before.
So we'll come back to Mr. Bernstein, who of course is the founder of Tikvah. But in the 60s in New York, you were getting another kind of education at the same time, right? This was a city in crisis.
That's absolutely right.
How did that shape you?
Well, I said I always read a lot. I liked reading. I would read on the trains. I would read on the weekends when I should have been spending more time with my children. But I read a great deal. And what I began to see, which I had never quite experienced before, how a society could collapse, break down. We had had this mayor, John Lindsay, an honorable, good man, unlike what we have today in New York. And he had a whole vision of how he was going to lift up the poor and lift them up through what the city could do for them. Meaning, spend money, give money, jobs, everything. And within a period of, 7 or 8 years, crime had gone through the roof. We actually, during '68, we experienced in New York and in the rest of the country the deaths of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, riots in big cities being burned out in many parts, tragic parts. And I began to see all of this stuff that I had read, how it was actually affecting what was going on in the world. Leadership mattered. If you don't have the right leaders, the right people who had really an understanding and a conviction and a belief in what the future of a town, a city, a state, or a country had to be, you would fail. And he had failed. And then we had a little, I shouldn't say little, I'm little, but a short guy named Abe Beam. And we had failure after failure. The Koch period, Ed Koch was an inspired mayor, a good man, but the city was deep in trouble by then. And so not only did he had some better ideas, but it's very hard to pull it out when the economic base has been so eroded. And so he stayed for 2 terms and improved New York. But by that time, we had 2,000 people a year were being killed in New York.
But living through this, watching it, what is it that you were trying to make sense of? How did this shape your education and your outlook?
I don't know. What it shaped was I understood how fragile these organisms were, meaning cities and towns and districts and schools. Everything can go quickly. It doesn't take so long. We're seeing that in part right now, tragically because of COVID, and what's happened with city policies. I mean, we have a situation today where people can actually commit crimes and there's no bail. They get released the next day. These are like crazy strategies. So what I began to understand, law, leadership, but leadership. someone who had ideas. And at that point in time, right in there, I either accidentally, I don't know how I got it. It was a new magazine that started to be published in 65. I didn't see it in 65. But it was published by Irving Kristol, and he was the editor.
The Public Interest.
Public Interest. And it was filled with really smart people. No pictures, no charts, no footnotes. Just ideas. And that's how I actually got to know Pat Moynihan. And these people were actually accessible. You could actually meet with them. You could call them. It was another era. James Q. Wilson would write for them. I mean, these were really extraordinary periods. And if anybody wants to actually go online to nationalaffairs.com, they actually have all of those original copies online. You can read them all. And you would learn a tremendous amount as it would apply the same way today. You would learn that same thing. And I learned there were things that you could do, and how to do them, and how to think it through. And that was an incredibly important time.
So
you saw the practical nature and the intellectual nature. I had this problem. What were some of the things that people were doing about policing? I mean, so these were really interesting. It was astonishing for me that there were actually people around there who had thought through in a very systematic way how to solve many of these problems, which were plaguing the city and other cities.
So now fast forward to the late 70s, early 80s, on this theme of leadership matters. In a very short period of time, you have these major new world leaders that emerge. Begin in Israel, Thatcher in the UK, Reagan, John Paul II. And in parallel, you've by then had some real success in business. You start getting involved in the world of think tanks, policy ideas. How did you get involved? What were you trying to achieve? And how did it intersect with the big shifts that were happening in American politics and in world politics at the time?
Well, remember now, in 81, I would have been 40 years old. So I'm already, our oldest child is 15. Our youngest child is 5.
And Bernstein had become fairly successful.
No, Bernstein was just beginning to be successful. Bernstein had 10 hard years because we made all kinds of mistakes. All kinds of mistakes. People mistakes, strategic mistakes, money management mistakes. So we really were failing on every possible cylinder. We were really...
You learned something, it sounds like.
Well, it took 10 years. It's amazing when I think of it that I stayed. But somehow I knew that it could work. And I was also, if I could have gone to work 7 days a week to business without my wife throwing me out, without ever thinking about going to synagogue and doing anything religious, I would have gone. I liked it so much. Nothing bothered me. Because you learned a lot. And you worked with very smart people. And it was intellectually a very intriguing thing.
It's good Susan didn't quite allow this.
There were many times, she often tells this story. There were many times on Saturdays, I would wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning, take a shower, put on a suit, put on a nice tie, and be ready to walk out of the house. And Susan would say, "Are you an idiot? It's Saturday." But that's what happened. but I loved it.
So come back to this world of political ideas.
So the world there is, what was so intriguing to me, New York was, at that point in time, basically, as it is today, a liberal city. And so if you had political points of view, intellectual points of view, policy points of view, that were somewhat more right of center, those communities were really open to you if you showed any interest whatsoever. So it's during that period of time I really first got to know Norman Podhoretz, a commentary, because I would read that all the time. And so what intrigued me here was there was an enormous amount of work done on thinking about those questions facing cities and states, and then the larger questions of the Soviet Union. And they all intrigued me. And so we had some extra money, and I would try to use it strategically to help those organizations. And since there weren't that many people in New York at that point in time that had some conservative orientation, and I had this conservative orientation even though I didn't understand it completely when I was just a very young person. I knew order. I knew the idea of rigor, some sort of law, things that there had to be certain habits and customs, and culture mattered an enormous amount. And so these people actually taught me by reading them and talking with them. And then there was, at that point in time, the Manhattan Institute, which is a public policy institute, had a tiny budget. And there was a partner that I knew from Oppenheimer who had now become chairman. And he came to see me and Mr. Bernstein, at our offices and said, I want one of you to go on this board. We're going to need you. This is going to be, we can make a big change in New York. We can do something. And so Bernstein said to me, you should do it. And he at that point in time, he was talking about actually becoming president of the United States. I said, God bless you. You want to become president. This will be a very good learning experience for you. But he was a very big believer that everybody should have lots of outside activities, as long as they don't work less. So he had a certain ambivalence too. He wanted you to do a lot outside, but then didn't want you to lose your time. But I went on that board, and that was a really big moment, because you could actually watch and see how these kinds of organizations could, if they were judicious, if they were really well run, if they really hired very good scholars, they could make a difference. And that was impossible to believe at that point in time.
So far in this story, being a Jew, Jewish ideas, Jewish life doesn't seem that central. What changes, and how do you end up 20 years ago as the chair of Tikvah, this Jewish organization with this Jewish mission?
No, it's a very perceptive and correct point. If I was anything at that point in time, I was a very strong Zionist. I knew Israel mattered to everything.
That was there from early
on. And then,
and that's because of the experience of the Holocaust or something
else?
I mean,
I began to understand that Israel was not just another country. This is what the Jews had waited their whole life for. And, this was only, when I was working I mean, Israel was 15 years old. It was so new. I went there the first time with Susan in 71. And, the country was 23 years old. It was amazing. But in the mid-70s, my wife really led this. She all of a sudden, I won't tell this whole story, but she one day just decided we were going to have a kosher home. And it didn't matter what I was going to eat. I wasn't going to eat it in this house ever again. And the kids weren't going to eat it. And that we had to really begin observing the Sabbath at least on Friday nights. We had to at least usher it in. We had to bring our children in. We had to have dinner together. Do all of these things. And things began to really change. But not enough. I was still not resistant. I was still ignorant. So here I had learned everything about all of these other countries, all of these other leaders, and didn't end up really learning enough about who I was as a Jew and what did Jewish mean?
But you weren't revolting. You just didn't. Your interest didn't turn there.
It didn't turn, and I didn't put the time that I had to do it. I took other avenues that continued to interest me. Getting more involved in foreign policy, getting more involved in Washington, helping Pat Moynihan become a senator from New York, trying to do lots of things that really intrigued me.
So your home life changed. Susan drove a change in how you were going to live, but that still hadn't driven yet an intellectual change.
No.
Or a sense of.
Well, it's a real sense of understanding what it is to be a Jew.
So what happened? At some point, this changed.
Well, some of it is you happened, in part. So I've mentioned this story before. Bernstein becomes a very successful firm by any measure. 2 or 3 key partners. One of them is Mr. Bernstein, obviously. The other is the real genius of the firm. I always say this, but it's true. Lou Sanders, and I was the third. And we built an incredibly strong team, and the firm went from 13 people to 1,000 people in 20 years without acquiring any companies. And so it really became financially successful. And in the early 90s, really, it became clear that Sandy, this was in the 80s, changed his name to Zalman, became Shomer Shabbos. Really, this took over his life in the best sense of the word. He actually changed to some degree. He didn't never change completely. But he decided, and we would argue a lot about many, many different things in business. But on politics, ideas, on books, we agreed on almost everything. And he decided, he had an early bout with cancer, but he decided he was going to give away all of his money to charity. He was going to give some of his money to kids, but not a lot. He had 3 children. And he started this foundation when he moved to Israel, in the United States, moved to Israel, called Avichai, My Father Lives. And this was this was something he lived with, breathed it, etc. Then he had another smaller foundation called Tikvah, I spoke to him about these all the time. It wasn't clearly defined what he was going to do. It was going to be like an investment partnership, buy smaller companies, which had he done and really stuck with, Tikvah would have been multiple billions, because he saw that Israel was beginning to really change technologically, intellectually, economically. And, this was in, Bibi Netanyahu was the Minister of Finance during the Sharon years, and he put through a lot of big changes economically. And at that point in time, I was thinking I was going to retire. I was in my late 50s, mid-50s. I was going to retire in my early 60s. I wanted to figure out how we could give away our money, Susan's and our money, meaning both of us, in the best way possible. And I've told this story before, so if all of you have heard this story, I apologize. But at that moment, this is 99, I get a call from Zalman. It's Sunday morning, early Sunday morning. Zalman did not call, he did not know that there was a time zone difference between Israel and the United States. Not quite, but it's very early. I go downstairs, pick up the phone. Susan's still asleep. And I say, how are you? The one thing you knew about him, he never added too many words to things. When he wanted to do something, he wanted to say something, he went right to the point. He says, I'm coming to New York in a couple of weeks. I'm going to get a bone marrow transplant. He had a virulent form of leukemia. And it's likely that I'm going to die. I need you to do something. Okay. He said, I want you to become chairman of Tikvah. I said, Sandy, are you crazy? I don't speak Hebrew. I know embarrassingly little about being a Jew. And I'm actually thinking to myself what I want to do with my life. And so he says something to me that I've said this once a couple of times. I haven't said it often. He had a real way to get right into you, to almost point the knife right in. And he knew that when my mother died, I hadn't said Kaddish for her. And so he brings it up in this conversation. He says, I know it still hurts you that you didn't respect your mother's death. You didn't say Kaddish because you didn't know how. No one even knew anything about it. No one understood this when I was 20 years old in the Bronx. And he said, one day you'll learn something about being a Jew. Take on this foundation. I trust you. Do what you think is right. What do you say? No? Obviously I said yes. And he was right. He was right on many of those kinds of things. He was wrong on many other things. But on those deeper insights, he had an unerring capacity to see through the mist, see through a fog, and act or get other people to act. And so the problem was Tikvah wasn't fully formed. And so for, I would say, maybe I took my time. I had to start thinking about it. I started to interview people. And the person who recommended you and Yuval was Leon Kass. I called him. He said, these are the two best people I've ever worked with. And I would have hired the two of you. I could have then gone off and done my own thing. But it was clear that you were the one that had a Jewish heart and a Jewish soul and had immense capacity to learn and grow. And in a way, I would be one of those people that would learn as well. I would learn from Tikvah as well. And it's true. And that's what happened. And so that's how I hired you, because I thought, A, you were young. And if there was anything that Bernstein agreed with, Bernstein always, when you hired someone, when you had someone reporting, when you were working at Bernstein, you had a number of people reporting to you, Bernstein was invariably driven to ask, if you get hit by a bus tomorrow, who can take your place? If you don't have that person, you're not doing your job. That's what leadership is. First and foremost, can you get great people? And he said, better than you. That's the highest compliment. And I thought when, I came upon you and Yuval, but especially you, I thought you'd be better than I would be by definition. You were younger, smarter, and driven. And you were at a stage of your life where this was like the most important thing in the world to you. Because being a Jew just had come to you relatively recently. And I looked at that and said, I think this is the right thing to do. I offered you that job. I never forget then the first decision you made, maybe the second, you moved to Princeton, New Jersey. I said, oh my God, he's going to be dead. He's on this train all day.
I didn't last there very long.
They didn't. But and then we slowly sort of built this vision, hiring people, making lots of mistakes, and mistakes are never bad, as long as you learn from them.
So, you've led Tikvah for 20 years. You've made a decision, which you're actually going to share in a letter to the world tomorrow, the Tikvah world, our community, that you're ready to step down. So, I guess the first thing I'd ask is, how would you describe our strategic evolution, meaning Tikvah's? What are the Jewish problems we're trying to meet, and what have we had to learn along the way? What do we still need to learn to try to meet them? And why now? Why step down?
Well, let me start with why step down first. It's important. As I've said to you, I've been fortunate that I've known many, many men in very prominent positions over the last 40 years. And, when you get to be 80 years old, it's not that I have anything wrong with me. It's wise to start taking steps for the next generation. To make that organization as best as you can insulated to big change, because there will be big change in all environments. And it's good to leave when people want you to stay, because as you get a little older, they might want you to leave, but you may not know it and you may resist it. And I didn't ever want to do that. I didn't want to do that at Bernstein, and I didn't want to do it here. And I've been chairman of the board of a number of institutions, and I've always left them after I thought I had completed the first real big step in how that organization would develop and grow. Not alone, with other people. But I thought this was the right time. And I still think it is. Now, where Tikvah is concerned, you know, this is where life is so interesting. This is where learning is so interesting. Most foundations are geared to be grant-giving foundations. They give money, they get requests, they evaluate them. Many of them do a really fine job. We started that way also. And Mr. Bernstein, by the way, in his separate letter to his trustee, was that the thing he wanted Tikvah to do is to really help what was then the Shalem Center, started by Yoram Mazzoni and Dan Polisar. And if they could, help them to develop as a college.
In Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem. I learned a lot from those two men as well. I watched them. They were obviously very gifted, very hardworking, and serious Jews, but seriously intellectual about Jews, about Israel, and they were conservative as well. And some of it stuck with me, and at some point it became clear, without spending a long time on this, that this grant-making function that we were doing, starting early on with a couple of very large grants, we had at that stage a significant amount of money, over $100 million, not $1 billion. And what was clear is we had to find something else. Did we have another way where we might influence future Jewish leaders? Because you don't need that many great Jewish leaders to affect change. And that usually means working with younger people. And so we started educating some of those people during the summers at Princeton, successfully. But that didn't quite work out as well, and we tried other avenues. But what became clear to me and you, if we had a comparative advantage, our advantage was in education. And it was an education at a very high level. And that we could run summer schools, courses, where we had the advantage to do three things that's very hard to do if you give away money. We could hire the teachers. We could create the curriculum with the teachers. And we could choose the students. That's a huge advantage. And we had to take advantage of that. And I think that ultimately reached its sort of like, God works in mysterious ways here. We never know exactly. Here comes COVID. And you, and this was you, brilliantly see the opportunity of using Zoom technology to educate young Jews that couldn't go to school and were sitting at home. And their parents, and they might really be interested in really conversations at a very high level, even in the 7th or 8th grade. And that was another very big step. And so that's where we are today. What steps there'll be going out there in the future, that's still yet to be decided. Not by us, but by what opportunities there are.
So Tikvah, the name has a meaning. It means hope. We could sit here and diagnose the many problems in the world today, in America, and the American Jewry, in Israel, the Middle East. There's much to worry about. But as you look at this with the sober and, wise eyes of your experience, where are the grounds for rational hope in American Jewry, in Israel, for the Jewish people?
In America, I think this is a very difficult time. Can it be overcome? Probably, but it's harder than I've ever seen it. Now maybe I'm older and maybe I see it that way. But I see it just with a jaundiced eye, colored. But I think things are much different today because where the Jews in this country are concerned, it's just not solving the problem of the Jews. I think that has historically been a tragic error. Jews have to be involved with Judaism, their home, their family, their schools, but they have to be involved with America. They are Americans as well, important Americans. And when America has difficulties, and many of those difficulties are usually political, and I'm not saying go out and vote Republican. It would be a terrible, miscarriage of justice to even interpret this, what I'm saying. But we can all see what's happening in some form or another in the country, and this will be a heavy lift going forward. And so what Tikvah can do is build what it's always been tried to do and hoped to do, is build great Jewish leaders. Whether they go into politics, rabbinics, whether they go into the academy, whether they go into business. That's something that I'm sure Mr. Bernstein would be really proud of. That's something that would have been an aspiration he would really have thought, and I know he thought of it. But Israel's a different story. Israel is a Jewish state. It is the Jewish state. It is the only Jewish state. And it has national security problems which are very different than America, although America's really working hard to catch up here, with real potential threats on many, many different levels today. But it has national security threats. It has a fractious population. And it is a country that still has achieved an enormous amount, but it's still growing and learning. And it too needs the right leadership. And just because they have been so successful, and we're blessed with that success, every day I think about it. But that doesn't mean it stays, or you're guaranteed. Too many people everywhere, in some way or another, are complacent. It's always been this way. It'll always work out. Begin will drop the bomb in Osirak. Yes, it'll work. Yes, yes, Grant and Sherman will take care and win the election for Lincoln. Yes, we'll recover from having an army the size of the 13th largest army in 1941 after being bombed at Pearl Harbor. You can't be complacent. You have to care about everything you believe in. So as much as you care about your family, as much as you care about Jewish life for your children, you have to care about your country and what you can do with it. And I think that's been, for me, in many cases for American Jewry, and the example I always use, is American Jewry has not nearly done enough to get funding from the state for Jewish education. It's amazing to me. It's impossible. Just passive about it. And this is probably the single most important thing if you are a serious Jewish man and woman who cares about the education of their children. When those educations today, for any modern Orthodox school, is $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year. And we haven't made a political case, we haven't used all of our power as a group, the scale we have, the intellect we have, to really make sure those politicians that we elect know this is what we want. Well, that's an important element in this whole thing for the future. So if what Tikvah can do a lot.
One of the things that you've taught me and that you learn from history is that leaders take risk at key moments. And I think you, in a way, took a big risk when you went to work for Mr. Bernstein, left Oppenheimer. He took a kind of risk in trusting you with Tikvah, despite your protestations that you didn't know enough, but he knew you would learn it. And, you know, on a personal note, you took a huge risk, perhaps an irrational one, in giving me the opportunity to work here. So there's so much to say, but I want to say on behalf of everybody who's benefited, the students, the readers, the listeners, the watchers, this community of Tikvah that we've tried to build over the years. If I can thank you on behalf of all of them for everything that you've done, and God willing will continue to do, even if not as chairman. And I want to thank you for opening up with your experiences and your wisdom, which I know we will all learn from. So Roger, on so many levels, thank you.
Thank you.
To everyone, good evening.